Hi guys, I'm Greg Lang, founder and CXO of Rivet, and I'm here with Alex Gluchowski, CEO of Matter Labs, Alex Wearn, CEO of IDEX, and David Hoffman, founder of Bankless. How are you guys today?
Absolutely
Doing
fantastic.
well,
Thanks for
thanks.
having us.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Well,
Greg.
today we're doing a bit of talking about Ethereum 2.0. Specifically, our topic was what to expect when you're expecting the rise of Ethereum 2.0. So just to get the audience who may not be that familiar with Ethereum 2.0 off to the races, question for the whole panel. What is Ethereum 2.0 and what makes it different from Ethereum 1.0?
Let's say that Ethereum is it's a protocol upgrade. And so there are certain things that are changing about Ethereum, and we can talk about the technical details of that. But I think at a broader, higher level, the point of Ethereum 2.0 is to increase access to the Ethereum protocol on two fronts. Making it easier to access the consensus mechanism of the Ethereum system. Right now, proof of work and mining is a very competitive game with massive economies of scale. And so to participate in proof of work consensus is very, very resource intensive and limits the decentralization and democratization of the participation in the consensus of the system. Proof of stake is meant to return consensus back to small consumer level laptops where you can actually provide security to these public permissionless blockchains from the comfort of your own home, which is it's good for getting the most amount of people participating in security and also for optimizing for decentralization, because now Ethereum lives in the living rooms of everyone who has just a consumer level laptop. And then Ethereum, on the other side of things, it also increases democratization of the access of the ability to write to the blockchain. And this is sharding. Scaling how much trustless block space Ethereum has allows more people to use it for cheaper fees. And so when I answer the question, what is Ethereum 2.0, it's really optimizations trying to increase the access to the consensus level, as well as increasing the democratization of the access to actually writing a transaction to the blockchain.
Cool. So you mentioned proof of stake. Alex W., I understand you have some relatively deep understanding of that. Can you describe what proof of stake is from your point of view?
Yeah, sure. So just one thing I'll add to David's comment. I think ETH 2.0, he did a great job explaining, proof of stake and sharding, which are the two main components. There's also this concept of rollups as another way to help scale the Ethereum network. And I think that's becoming a big part of the overall thesis of 2.0, is that these components together really give the scalability that's necessary. And the other element I would add is that 2.0 is kind of the current term for this package of coming upgrades, but they're going to be released in phases. Everything's not happening at once. It's not like you flip the switch and now 2.0 is live and 1.0 is behind us. So I fully expect that some of these things may change further along the way. But I think it's good to kind of rally around a vision, and as we've seen over the last few years, that those changes, the prescriptive changes, have become more precise. Proof of stake, as David mentioned, is a different consensus mechanism, a different way of coming to consensus on what the correct valid history is of the blockchain network. So if people are familiar with proof of work, that's the mechanism that both Ethereum and Bitcoin use today. Miners around the world are solving math problems, for lack of a better way of putting it, in order to get the right to then publish the recent history. Everyone's able to see the history that they publish, verify and validate that block. And the kind of game theory is that because you spent all this hardware, electricity, all these real world costs in order to get the right to validate, and that right earns you new Bitcoin, you're incentivized to behave honestly. There's a little more to it, but that's kind of the basic gist of the game theory and why it works in proof of work. In proof of stake, it's changing that economic incentive to, instead of having to put up capital and energy, you're putting up staked assets in the form of Ethereum that essentially act as a form of a deposit. Think of it like a security deposit on an apartment that you're renting. So as long as you're a good renter, as long as you honestly validate the state and validate transactions, you'll continue to earn fees. Everyone will be happy. If you act maliciously, and there's it's a complex process, but it boils down to, if you act maliciously and try to cheat the system or insert invalid transactions, then you can forfeit your stake. So it's switching the mechanism by which users are incentivized to behave honestly. The big difference from as David was mentioning is that you no longer need really intensive hardware to solve the proof of work mining algorithm, because you're no longer doing that hash computation in order to get the right to put forward a valid block. It's based on your stake. So while you still have the economic incentives, you're able to democratize the access to who's able to participate in that system.
Brilliant. So you mentioned rollups and sharding. I'm going to pass that one off to Alex G to talk about. You know a bit about both of those things, if I'm correct. So go ahead.
Absolutely. So rollups is the idea that we can improve the throughput capacity of the layer one by structuring transactions in a certain way so that the validators do not have to do all the work to verify every single transaction, but they can instead rely on other mechanisms. So the idea in blockchains is that we have trustless peer-to-peer networks where we don't have a central authority. You don't have any single point of failure because the network is consisting of equal peers. But that means that everyone has to check what everyone else is doing. And if we just would do it naively, then we would have quadratic complexity of the communication and computation and storage, and that just doesn't scale to the extent of the real world. So the sharding is an approach where we separate the work that the validators or like full nodes need to do by just grouping them in separate subsets, and each subset verifies only a fraction of the total transactions. That is important from the data availability standpoint. Rollups are a slightly different idea where you solve data availability through some other means. You still publicize the data through the network. You propagate it to all the nodes, but they don't have to do the work to verify every single transaction. They rely on one of the two mechanisms. We have two different types of, two different flavors of rollups. The one is called optimistic rollup. The other one is ZK rollup. In the optimistic rollup, you rely on incentive mechanisms and some game theoretical mechanisms for a lot of people to verify those transactions. And you can be sure that with sufficient incentives, some of them will actually catch the malicious behavior and do certain actions on the layer one to counter that, to revert the blocks which were fraudulent. With ZK rollups, it's a bit more advanced. We rely on sophisticated cryptography, on zero knowledge proofs, which have been in research for the last 30 years and now coming to fruition with very, very mature algorithms, which actually prevent any fraud from happening in the first place. So every Ethereum full node verifies the entirety of transactions in the rollup with a very small, simple mathematical algorithm, which has a constant cost verifying a number of transactions.
Okay, so if I'm hearing you right, it sort of breaks the work that any individual validator has to do up and sort of makes it heterogeneous in with respect to sharding, so that it doesn't all have to be done by everybody in parallel. And then as far as rollups are concerned, it's a way to aggregate things into aggregate a lot of interactions that would normally be transactions into a single transaction that can still be proved. Correct. Okay, cool.
Even though this single transaction can have certain properties that are cost-wise proportional to the number of transactions in your block.
Cool. David, do you have anything to follow up or add to that on?
Yeah, I would actually like to point out that the progress that layer 2s and ZK rollups, like Alex was just talking about, that's actually separate from Ethereum 2.0. That's just scaling solutions that technically can be implemented on any Turing complete blockchain. But with Ethereum 2.0, there is a meaningful relationship between the new system, the new Ethereum, and rollups. And that's because with the long-term vision that people are trending towards, that people are kind of seeing this play out, is that the main base layer protocol, what we we are now calling Ethereum 2.0, which in the future we will just call Ethereum. The Ethereum L1, it's envisioned that the L1 is just a traffic controller of value between all these different L2s. And so we all kind of are spoiled right now in the sense that we are so early to Ethereum that we are actually making transactions on the main chain. I think in 5-10 years, that's going to be a ludicrous statement, just because there's so much density of transactions coming from rollups that all the Ethereum, what we're now calling Ethereum 2.0, all that we'll be doing will be ferrying value across rollups. And so the theory is that everyone's about to migrate towards these L2s and like kind of move out into the suburbs and live on these L2s. And then they will use the Ethereum protocol to settle between L2s. And so while the ZK rollups and optimistic rollups, while they are technically part of the Ethereum protocol specifically, they do have a very fundamental part of the overall story of Ethereum.
Okay, cool. That makes a lot of sense. So with all these things, I'm going to take us to a more general question. So with all of these things coming in, we've got some existing attitudes, ideas, modes of interacting with things, building habits, best practices that have developed. How do those change? What does migrating from an ETH1 to an ETH2 world look like for developers, users, and people who are investing in these projects that are building on them? Who wants to take that one?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, I think the main hope is that it makes things, by increasing throughput by multiple orders of magnitude, it makes current applications that are not possible. Right. So things that have been priced out recently just because transactions are too expensive for certain types of applications can now become possible. And I think the success on Ethereum so far has been overwhelmingly DeFi and probably partially NFTs, both of which deal with high value transactions. Right. You can make $1 million stablecoin trade today with very little slippage, and that's a fantastic user experience. But if you're a small person with $40 looking to get involved, you're going to quickly burn through any sort of balance that you have just by paying to actually use the underlying network. So, I think that's probably the main thing that I'm most excited about is, people call it the dial up to broadband moment, and a little trite, but I do think that is a reasonable comparison, and that we can expect to see new types of applications that just haven't been feasible yet.
Cool. That's a great metaphor. Alex G, do you have anything to add to that, or do you want to move on to a different question I can throw at you? Your call.
So we have multiple dimensions when we're talking about migration. So one is the user experience, like what will change for the end users, how they will perceive or like act differently on the blockchain. The other one is from the perspective of developers. Like what's going to change? Do we have to change the code of our contracts? Will the old applications work? All the work that have been invested in the, we have a massive infrastructure on Ethereum 1.0 battle tested for a long time. It's actually very important, very interesting to know that all smart contracts are incredibly vulnerable systems because they are so exposed to attacks. The attack surfaces is very open. You don't have firewalls. So if like the code is open, you can't rely on security by obscurity. So if there is something wrong, sooner or later it will be spotted. So the most important indicator of security is lindiness. How long has a given system been running without failure? And this is a very interesting question. Like how this, like, are we going to have some minor changes in the operation of the system so that we cannot migrate it easily? All the audited protocols and protocols that have been running on ETH1. So I think it's still going to be an open question. Maybe David, Alex, you want to touch on that?
This is actually a subject I'm not too particular with because I'm not a technical level like you guys are.
Cool. I'd say one thing I would just add is I think the importance not only from a security perspective but also from the network effect. People talk about the network effect of Ethereum, and I think that viewpoint is evolving to realize that the network effect is really around the EVM and the Ethereum virtual machine, as it's called. The point being that all of this code that's been written for smart contracts, all of the supporting wallets, things like Etherscan, they all know how to communicate in this same language. And I think when you look at some of the other L1s that have gained traction recently, or even some of the early Ethereum L2s, they've had EVM compatibility as a key component because it's made it so easy for both teams and users to migrate over. You have the same application that you can just deploy with minimal additional effort. Users are already trained on those patterns of behavior. They understand things like gas, kind of the way that you price transactions on the network. So rebuilding that or changing that too much is just a risk that I imagine we'll want to minimize with this migration.
Absolutely, absolutely. So another point that's probably worth touching on is, as far as proof of stake is concerned, you've got now folks who are not dependent upon compute to build capacity on the network. Instead, it's it's your capital. It's how much ETH you can afford, as opposed to how much compute you can afford. You could see a situation where validators become sort of this cartelized thing, right? And the little guy again gets edged out, but just in a new way. What are your guys' thoughts on that? Is that a problem? Is this something that we ought to be concerned with, or is this something that, as long as it doesn't get out of hand in some way we can't foresee, is not going to cause issues with the permissionlessness or liveness or the decentralization as it is of the ecosystem? What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, totally. And people often talk about this crypto industry as if it's a solution to like wealth inequality and wealth distribution. It's not. Wealth distribution is what it is. What Ethereum 2.0 really helps doing is it helps make that wealth distribution not get too far out of hand, because somebody who stakes $1,000 worth of ether in his staking pool should generally get a pretty comparable rate of return over the long term, so long as they're not messing around paying too much in gas, and they kind of just hold out for the long term, as somebody who comes in and stakes 100 million in ether. Everyone receives the same rate of return because we've been able to democratize access to staking, because you can stake in your own home. And so crypto is not a solution to wealth inequality, but the way that Ethereum is being constructed is it does help it not make it any worse. And as far as wealth inequality goes, not making things worse is actually one of the best solutions that we've been able to come up with as a human collective, because wealth distribution has been a problem since hunter-gatherers.
Cool. Alex G, do you have any thoughts on the cartelization point, or if that's an issue, or if it's not an issue, or if it's more of a problem, for instance, that we've spec'd the thing to require that casual users can stay into it? So that might create some issues on the other side of the risk equation. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So my impression is that Ethereum, or the ownership of ETH, is decentralized to a very high degree. Compared to other layer ones, we have a very good distribution of this ETH supply for now. So initially, that certainly should not be an issue. Over a long time, it might lead to a situation where wealth slowly accumulates in the hands of a few people, and this can actually become a security concern. So this like, if the security of the network did not depend on the validators at all. If we only use cryptography, for example, like in ZK Rollups, we never rely on validators for the validity of transactions. Everything is verified by zero-knowledge proofs, but we still rely on the validators for, in the case of Rollups, we rely on layer one, the validators of layer one, for the canonicality, so like we preventing double spends, and or just censorship resistance. So for this kind of things, it is actually important that the network is sufficiently decentralized, and I think I believe Ethereum is going to remain active for a very long time. It's a technology for decades to come. So I would love to see some ideas that will solve this problem in the future, but I think we can safely postpone them until Ethereum 3.0.
Cool.
I think another potential risk that I haven't given it too much thought, but I imagine others are thinking of, is just the fact that centralized exchanges and big custodians are definitely going to be validators. It's an extra form of income for either themselves, they can take a percentage of that and then pass the rest on to their the users that are custodying with them or trading on the platform. And so just thinking through, does that represent a centralization risk? Because typically when they look at proof of work networks and centralization, you're looking at mining pools, which are made up of individual miners who, if the pool actor started to misbehave, they can point their hash power at a different pool for that kind of aggregation. It's a little different if you've been custodying your assets to trade on a particular platform and they're using those to validate, and then they get some, in the most extreme case, pressure from an external, government actor, someone that's pressuring them to censor transactions or change their behavior. It's not quite as easy to have users who aren't familiar with self-custody to get them to then withdraw, learn how to do the whole process themselves, whereas miners are kind of prepared for that potential to point it at a different pool. So I have no clue what the ratios look like for. I think that'd probably be an interesting just like starting point, like how much does Coinbase and Binance control of the hold in terms of the supply, and is that a realistic risk? But certainly a point of centralization in the network, I would say, to be aware of.
On this same train of thought, Dan Elitzer put out this article called "The Death of Ethereum," and it was DETH, and that talked about what he was concerned about, which was if there are centralized stakers or even decentralized stakers, staking pools where you can come and deposit your Ether into a specific staking pool or a centralized staking entity like Coinbase, they could in theory issue you a note, a redeemable note on that deposit, and then that note could be something that you might use as collateral in DeFi. And when multiple people start trying to do this, to try and claim some of the share of the market, what can happen is that really the most liquid secondary note of staked Ether, the most liquid one is going to win. And so there's some liquidity, and there's some liquidity centralization, because liquidity begets liquidity, right? So people are going to generally stake with the entity that allows them to receive the most liquid, the most accepted, the most integrated into DeFi note, and so they can use that in DeFi. And then that kind of forces convergence upon one single entity that has a lot of the stake, because everyone wants the liquid secondary note. Now, if Coinbase is the issuer of that secondary note, that's a concern. There's also DeFi apps that could be the issuer of this staked Ether note, and that, in my mind, starts to actually improve things. There's Lido Finance, which is secured by a multi-sig, which is a step in the right direction. My eyes are on Rocket Pool, because this is an actual protocol trying to become a staking as a service in a decentralized fashion. And so if the RETH version, which is the Rocket Pool staked ETH, if that becomes the canonical version of a secondary market for staked Ether, maybe that solves this problem, because now it's a DeFi app. And we like to say in DeFi, protocols are built that can't be evil. So maybe that's a solution to that problem.
Cool. That's a great rabbit hole to go down here. But unfortunately, we're getting close to the edge of time. So I just wanted to ask you guys one last question. We know the spec is not final, right? Like, things do get changed. And until that's got finality, we've either got to push for things to stabilize so that people know what to expect and it doesn't change, or we've got to get the changes we need in now. So which side of the line are each of you on? Do you want the spec to finalize, or do you think there's one thing that still needs to go into it? And if so, what is that? And try to keep it short, because we've only got a few minutes left.
I do think that there's some urgency to get Ethereum 2.0 out the door. We can kind of see the end of the tunnel. Like, it's on the horizon. It's right there. And so, like, let's get this done. And to some degree, there is a narrative about green energy and mining consumption that I think Ethereum would really enjoy not having to deal with that fight. And so there is some amount of urgency. But at the end of the day, if Danny Ryan comes to me, Danny Ryan, the coordinator of Ethereum 2.0, and says, hey, we need to unfreeze the spec, like, he's the expert. And so I'll listen to him.
Cool. Alex G., what are your thoughts?
I'd rather take a perspective of thinking it through thoroughly and putting all the necessary changes before we launch, because the moment we launch and everyone migrates, it will be extremely difficult to change anything, or like at least orders of magnitude more difficult. And we see it with Ethereum 1. It's very hard to push through precompiles or any changes in the protocol, and they take forever. And ETH2 is an effort itself to just completely reconsider the old system, to take all the lessons learned from the operation of Ethereum 1 and bring it into the new system. So I would rather take just a little more time to make things right.
Cool. Alex W., last word.
Yeah, one last comment. So I actually think that in some ways the delays to date have maybe been beneficial because it's forced the market to look to optimistic and ZK rollups as alternatives, and has created a I don't know 10 viable kind of different teams that are really pushing these technologies forward. And I think what you're going to end up with is a much better end product because of the combination of the core work from the foundation and these kind of decentralized groups that are working on these things that can build on top of it. So maybe just a silver lining in some of the delays that it's actually led to some great innovation in other areas that I think will lead to a better product in the end. Cool.
Well, that's awesome. Well, I think that's all the time we have today, guys. Thank you, Alex Wearn. Thank you, Alex Gluchowski. Is that how you would pronounce it?
That's correct.
David Hoffman for joining me today and talking to everybody. I learned a lot. I hope our audience learned a lot, and we'll see you all around the summit. Cheers.